In the spring of 1861, the United States tore itself apart. 11 southern states seceded, forming the Confederate States of America. With the firing of the first shots on Fort Sumter, the nation was plunged into a brutal civil war, one that would test endurance, strategy, and sheer willpower. By 1862, the South was winning. Confederate forces had claimed victory in key battles, pushing Union troops back across Virginia and beyond. The war's momentum favored the South, and the Union struggled to find a decisive breakthrough. The Union needed a victory.
James Andrews was a Kentuckian. He was a civilian during the Civil War. He had a reputation for being a smuggler, but he was working directly with the U.S. government as a civilian, as a spy, to acquire as much information about the Confederate war effort as possible. Andrews understood that the Civil War was almost first and foremost a rail war. It was one of the earliest rail wars in world history, and it was certainly the United States' first war that was basically dependent on the transportation of war material, the transportation of men, and access to supply lines and supply chains. So Andrews had this idea of attacking Confederate supply lines directly by attacking them in the heartland, burning bridges, tearing up track, and doing whatever he could to impede whatever progress the Confederates were making.
He came up with this idea and presented the idea to steal a train from Marietta and tear up the railroads between Marietta and Chattanooga with General Buell to begin with. Then he presented it to General O.M. Mitchell, came up with this idea, we're going to steal a train.
Locomotives were important in the Civil War because of the amount of weight that they could pull, make them excellent pieces of equipment for fueling a war, for feeding troops, for making sure that your men get to the right place, and for maintaining consistent supply lines.
And at that early in the war, we're talking March of 1862, Chattanooga was an extremely important supply depot. A lot of supplies coming out of Alabama and Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, were being sent into Chattanooga and then up to West Virginia and Virginia to General Lee's army. And Chattanooga being that distribution site for West Tennessee, East Tennessee, and Virginia, it was so important. Chattanooga was the major hub that was accessible to the Union Army.
Primarily, most of the participants were volunteers from 3 different Ohio regiments, the 2nd, the 21st, and the 33rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiments. So this was primarily manned by people who were serving their country from the state of Ohio.
They didn't know in the beginning what they were going to do when they all got to Shelbyville. And they were finally told by James Andrews exactly what the mission was. They had the option to go back to their regiments. Every single one of them stayed. All 22 stayed, knowing what could be the consequences for them.
Because of the rainstorm the previous night, they did have to push it to April 12th to basically seize whatever locomotive was available. The general was carrying passengers between Atlanta and Chattanooga, so it was the ideal train to steal to get 24 men onto the same train. It is certainly possible that any other train could have been the one that was stolen. It just happened to be the general that was running at the right time. They went to the station, they all bought the same tickets, and they got on the general.
At that point, they started running the train north, and William Fuller got out of his breakfast and started screaming, "They're stealing my train, they're stealing my train." To begin with, he thought it was Confederate deserters that had stole the train.
So as soon as his train left Big Shanty, he didn't have a telegraph station nearby at that stop, so he immediately set out on foot, ran after the train for about 2 miles, picked up a push car till he can get to just anywhere, find any kind of locomotive to help.
Then a train called the Texas came, and William Fuller commandeered the Texas because he knew the engineer at the time. At that point, he ran the Texas at 60 miles an hour backwards.
Meanwhile, James Andrews and the raiders are continuing northward. They are cutting telegraph lines.
But because of William Fuller, throughout the entire event, on the 12th of April, these men couldn't stop it to get water. They couldn't get wood. They couldn't stop to really cut the telegraph lines like they wanted to.
And although there were several places to refuel, every time James Andrews would have to stop to get water or wood, that just adds more time to his operation, at which point his pursuers are continuing to make gains on him.
Well, they had finally ran out of wood and water in Ringgold, Georgia, had to abandon the train, and of course it was split up, caused as much trouble as they could to be caught. And over the next 4 weeks, they ended up all getting caught. And on June 18, 1862, 7 of these men were taken out to be hanged. At that point, when the executioner was putting the rope around George Wilson's neck of the 2nd Ohio, he looked out and he said, "I don't blame you for what you do, but I blame your government. But one day the stars and stripes will fly proudly over this land again." Pretty powerful for a man that's getting ready to be hanged. These men were hanged and then buried. Some of them escaped over the next few weeks. Some of them were exchanged back to Union lines. Eventually, by 1863, they got back to Union lines to tell their story.
So in a large sense, the raid failed in that very specific context of, hey, we have these military objectives, this is what we want to try to do. It failed in that sense. But in terms of the perception of this raid, it showed Confederates that they were extremely vulnerable along the rail lines. They did not realize that an operation like this could happen so far in the Deep South.
This event was more dangerous than the loss of Shiloh, the loss at Vicksburg, the Gettysburg events. That if this had been successful, that would have been more devastating than those battles. And I believe that if this raid would have been successful, I really believe that the war would have been shortened by minimum of a year. And in that last year, 64, early 65, you're looking at a couple 100,000 lives.
The Medal of Honor is our highest award given for valor on the battlefield. It is a medal that basically represents the best of all the men and women that have served.
On July 12, 1862, Congress passed a bill, of course, creating the Army Medal of Honor. But also in that bill, it created the ability for the President of the United States to purchase land to become our national cemeteries. In that bill, creating the legacy for our service personnel.
On March 25th, 1863, 6 of the original members of the 22 Raiders received the Medal of Honor.
So you've got the original men who were released and did a full interview March 27th, 1863 with Secretary of War Stanton. So they were there, and of course they're going to use that opportunity to give out those medals right away. President Lincoln actually gave out the first medal to Jacob Parrott. So they've got those, and then you've got guys getting released later. They're, being out separated. Regiments are in the field. So it's taking year upon year in submission to get these, having to prove it, get affidavits for it. Samuel Llewellyn, who was one of the men who was caught up in Tennessee, he turned his down. And of course, Philip Perry Shadrach and George Davenport Wilson, somehow in the process were overlooked.
So you look back and say, why didn't Private Wilson and Private Shadrach receive the medal? You got to go back to 1863, 64. The war was moving fast. The leaders that put in the paperwork were transferred. Some were likely killed in battles, in future battles. Unfortunately, their sacrifice and what happened, their story was never really thought about, and I'm sure this is an oversight.
I knew about the Andrews raid and the Great Locomotive Chase, and I'd been up to the Chattanooga National Cemetery and saw the headstone. And I always wondered, did they just not put the Medal of Honor headstones up for Wilson and Shadrach? Andrews and Campbell didn't have them because they were civilians. What was the story? And I just thought about it, and then we were commemorating in Marietta, Georgia, the 150th events of the Great Locomotive Chase. We had so many descendants of these men there. I was selling my first book, and up walks a young man, Ron Shadrach. And he said, "Brad, I've been asking around, and everybody says I need to come to you. I'm trying to get the Medal of Honor for my great, great, great cousin, Philip Shadrach and George Davenport Wilson. Will you help?"
Anything with a Medal of Honor recipient, it takes time for that nomination to make its way through, because it goes through probably 2-3 years of review, documentation, witness statements, and you basically have to build a case.
In a lot of ways, bureaucracy plays a part in who is recognized for their services. You definitely do have to demonstrate the effort that you went to while serving in the nation's military to be eligible for such an award. And at that point, it does become a matter of trying to just get everything in order, because so many people do serve their country that you definitely want to make sure that this is going to the people who really deserve recognition for such an award.
So I'm up digging in the National Archives, finding a primary source document. We didn't have eyewitness reports, so primary source. So the next thing I find in the National Archives in DC is a Confederate document. And that document is actually a list, primary source document list of every single member of the Great Locomotive Chase. In it is Shadrach and Wilson. So I've got that. Then I'm digging again, working for a client in the archives, and I find a document misfiled in court-martial records. And it's a 32-page testimony of 5 members of Andrews Raid, March 27, 1863, in front of Secretary of War Stanton. And it mentions Shadrach and Wilson multiple times. I have got new primary source documents. So at this point, our packet is up at the Pentagon, and I'm fighting it. We hear, okay, maybe. Ron and I are in constant contact. Maybe we're going to get it. We've got multiple congressmen and senators involved, and there's highs and lows. At one point, we're so close. You know, the verbiage coming to us out of the Pentagon is, you know, it's going to happen, it's there. And then we get a letter that it's not been approved yet in the process. And I'm thinking it at 8 years into this, it's not going to happen. On June 18th, 2024, I'm sitting at my desk in my home office trying to do some work. I couldn't do anything all day. It's 162 years from the date they were hanged. It's going to come today. And the evening goes, and I post on my Facebook page that I'm crushed. This is a day, I know it could be the day. At 9:30 p.m. on June 18th, the phone rings. I look at the number, and I know it's the Pentagon. I pick it up. Paula Smith says, Brad, we're going to be awarded the Medal of Honor. The event is going to be July 3rd. The families have asked that you come. I didn't sleep much that night.
It took 10 plus years of working, advocating, making the case. You would think it had been an easy thing to do, but it took a lot of work from a lot of people to make that day possible. Fortunately, President Biden signed that piece of paper that allowed the families to receive the medals. But more importantly, it got to credit 2 men that gave their lives for the defense of our country.
And then to sit July 3rd in the White House at 4:45 p.m. and watch the president give Gerald Taylor, the great nephew of Philip Shadrach, and Teresa Chandler, the great granddaughter of George Russell, to watch those 2 accept the Medal of Honor after those years of work. That was special.
The easiest way to think about the Andrews Raid in terms of its legacy, I think, is partly the public perception and the public imagination when it comes to this chase between 2 locomotives. I think it's certainly an incredible story, certainly one that in some ways seems implausible.
The sacrifice that Private Wilson and Shadrach made on April 12, 1863 is an important part of who we are as Americans. It is a story that, even though it's 163 years ago, it is a story that I hope that Americans will start to know, because we can learn a lot from what they did in a particular time, but we face those same challenges in our everyday life.
Their courage set the standard for generations of heroes to come. And over 150 years later, the last 2 of Andrews Raiders finally received the recognition they had long been denied. This is their story, the story of Andrews Raiders and the Great Locomotive Chase.